The moment of silence between Officer Jackson and Matthews stretched long, thick with the weight of the situation. Veronica stood tall, her hands at her sides, her posture unyielding. The frustration she had been holding in since the moment Matthews pulled her over was now replaced by a cold, controlled clarity. She knew this wasn't just about her. This was a confrontation that could make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted or profiled simply because of their skin color. Matthews seemed to shrink under her gaze, his earlier confidence now cracked and fraying at the edges. The presence of Officer Jackson didn't help him either. She was still studying Veronica with an expression that seemed to be slowly changing from disbelief to realization. "Ma'am, I didn't know," Matthews began, but his words faltered. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I was just following procedure. It's not personal." "Not personal." Veronica's voice cut through the air with precision, her eyes narrowing. "You pulled me over because of the color of my skin, officer. Don't tell me that's not personal." Officer Jackson's jaw tightened. She turned toward Matthews, her eyes flashing with disapproval. "David, you're going to need to explain this. This isn't how we do things." For a brief moment, Matthews was speechless. He couldn't meet her eyes, and when he finally did, it was clear that he was grappling with the enormity of his mistake. Veronica could see it, the conflict in his eyes, the realization that he had crossed a line. But it wasn't enough. It never was. Too many had felt this sting, too many had suffered because of these assumptions, and nothing Matthews was going to say now could undo that. "Officer Jackson," Veronica continued, her voice firm and unwavering, "I need your supervisor here. Now. This goes beyond a simple apology or an admission of error. You need to address what's happening here. Now." Officer Jackson nodded quickly, reaching for her radio. Matthews stood silently, his hands twitching at his sides, clearly waiting for this storm to pass. But there was no easy way out of this, not for him, not for the system that allowed this to happen. As Jackson relayed the request for a supervisor, Veronica stood still, her eyes fixed on Matthews. The young officer shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, his lips pressed together in what could only be described as reluctant shame. He knew what he had done, even if he hadn't fully understood it before. The air grew heavier as the minutes ticked by. Veronica could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just the waiting, it was the weight of this moment. She had the power to turn the tide here, to make sure that this moment was recognized, that the conversation about racial profiling wasn't just something to discuss in quiet corners but was something that needed to be confronted head-on. Veronica glanced at the officer standing next to Matthews. Officer Jackson had been silent since requesting the supervisor, but Veronica knew that the young officer's discomfort wasn't lost on her. She wasn't fooled. Officer Jackson, like many others, had probably witnessed enough of this to know how it worked. The question was, would she take action or turn a blind eye like so many others before her? A few minutes later, another police vehicle pulled up. A tall man, likely in his late 40s, stepped out with a calm yet commanding presence. Sergeant Robert Clark had been with the department long enough to know how to handle high-stress situations. His reputation preceded him as someone who followed protocol to the letter. But now, standing in front of Veronica Williams, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, as if the weight of the situation had taken him off balance. Clark took one look at Matthews, then at Veronica, and his eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he turned to Officer Jackson, who quickly briefed him on the situation. Veronica could hear their murmured exchange, but her focus remained on Matthews, who looked like he was trying to shrink into the pavement beneath his boots. Finally, Clark turned to Veronica. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying caution. "Ma'am," he began, "I understand you're upset, but this situation could have been handled differently. Officer Matthews didn't know who you were at first. Are you trying to justify racial profiling, Sergeant?" Veronica's voice sliced through the air like a sharp blade. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. This was what needed to be said. Because this wasn't about what I did, it was about what you assumed based on my skin color. It's about the fact that Officer Matthews didn't see me as a person, but as a threat. Clark's face tightened, but he didn't respond. Veronica could see the internal struggle in his eyes. He wanted to play this off as a small mistake, a one-time misunderstanding. But the truth was, it was never just one mistake. It wasn't just about Matthews. It was about the entire system that allowed for this behavior, the system that created an environment where black people were routinely stopped, harassed, and dismissed because of the color of their skin. "You're absolutely right," Clark said after a long pause. "This was wrong. And it shouldn't have happened." Veronica's gaze never wavered. "I'm glad you're finally acknowledging that. But this isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who are stopped every day without cause, who are treated as guilty before being proven innocent, simply because of who they are." The weight of her words hung in the air as Clark shifted uneasily. Matthews, still standing in the background, didn't speak a word. The silence was deafening as the full realization of the situation began to set in. The officer had made a choice, and now, the consequences were beginning to unfold. The supervisor turned to Matthews. "I want you to follow me, now," Clark commanded, his voice cold but firm. "We'll discuss your actions in more detail. You can't just make assumptions about people, not without consequences." Matthews seemed to shrink before Veronica's eyes, the arrogant stance he'd once carried so confidently, now faltering. "Yes, sir," Matthews muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Veronica took a deep breath. This moment wasn't over. She had made a statement, but it was far from the end. There would be investigations, meetings, and reports filed, but there was still so much more to be done. She wasn't just a judge in the courtroom. She was going to be a voice for change, and this was only the beginning. As Matthews and Clark walked toward their squad car, Officer Jackson hesitated. She glanced at Veronica, her expression thoughtful but conflicted. Veronica caught her eye and nodded slightly. Jackson looked away quickly, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. It was evident that she had seen enough to understand that this wasn't just one officer's mistake. It was systemic. Veronica turned to leave, but as she walked toward her car, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It was her colleague, Judge Anderson. But just as she was about to answer, she caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. 2 more police cars had arrived at the scene, and there was an officer she hadn't seen before, one with a stern look and an air of authority that seemed to push against the sudden calm of the moment. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that this wasn't just a simple incident. This was far from over. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.